So in the last lecture segment, we looked at epithelial tissue and connective tissue. In this segment, we're going to look at muscle tissue and neural tissue, and then some basic physiological processes. So muscle tissue includes three types: smooth, skeletal, and cardiac. Smooth and cardiac are both involuntary type muscles. Smooth muscle is what surrounds your digestive organs so that it moves by squeezing. It moves the food through the digestive tube, and that contraction is called peristalsis. Cardiac muscle is in your heart, and it contracts to pump the blood through the circulatory system. So both smooth and cardiac are involuntary. The skeletal muscle is voluntary. It moves your bones. All three types have visual differences when you look at the tissue under the microscope, for example, and that has to do with the structure of the cells in the tissue. The skeletal muscle has very clear striations, and that has to do with the way the fibers line up and how they overlap when they're contracting. The cardiac muscle has some striations, and the smooth muscle does not. So the striations is that striped appearance. The cardiac muscle and smooth muscle only have one nucleus per cell. Skeletal muscle has, well, we say it has many nuclei in each cell, although the cells are really multiple cells that are all fused together. And when you have something like that in biology, it's called a syncytium. And a syncytium, trying to get my pen, oops, is spelled like this: syncytium, or we say the cells are syncytial. A syncytium is a situation where there are many nuclei surrounded by plasma membrane. Or we say syncytial is an adjective, syncytial. And this concept comes up in other places in biology, but in this case it's referring to the skeletal muscle cells with multiple nuclei. So the neurons will send an electrical impulse to the muscle tissue, which then contracts. Now, neural tissue is very distinctive looking. You have the cells of neural tissue, the neurons, have kind of a fat end. It's called the soma, or the cell body. And then they have a long extension here called the axon. And then on each end, they have these long extensions of the cytoplasm and plasma membrane. And those are called dendrites. The dendrites are the ones on the cell body side. On the other end, at the end of the axon, we have the terminals. There are these kind of extensions here. And what you have in neural tissue is the neurons are set up so that, and you can see it here, you can see the end of one neuron here, and here are the terminals connecting to or getting very close to the dendrites of the neuron in the center. And then the neuron in the center has its axon terminals, which are getting very close to the dendrites of the next neuron. And so there's a little space in between here, between the axon terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of the next neuron. That little space is called a synapse. And that's the space where neurotransmitters, which are chemicals, are released by the axon terminals. They cross through the space and they are received by and bound by receptors on the dendrites. And that's how the electrical impulse, which goes down one cell, is then passed to the next cell. So the electrical impulse is really a charge across the membrane, okay? And you'll learn all about the impulse, how an impulse is passed down a neuron when you take anatomy and physiology. But here you see the basics of the neuron. There are some other cells that are called glial cells. They're supportive. The oligodendrocyte helps to insulate the axon, because the axon is in some ways like an electrical wire, and it functions better, more efficiently if it's insulated. And there are other supportive cells, but for this course we're just looking at the main neuron. Okay, now to some basic physiology. Most physiological processes run or are controlled by a negative feedback system. And this is a very common concept in all kinds of places in biology. Biochemical enzymatic reactions, biochemical pathways run often on a negative feedback system. But we're talking at the level of the organism, the organ system and organism, and these also run on a negative feedback. And what a negative feedback means is that something that's produced during the process then shuts off the process. So it's very much like a thermostat in your house. When you have the air conditioning turns on and the house gets cool, and when the house gets cool enough, that causes the air conditioner to turn off. Or when it gets too cold and the heater turns on, but when it gets warm enough, the heater turns off. So the goal is to keep the body within a pretty narrow range physiologically of, for example, blood sugar, or temperature or pH of the blood. So there are certain set points that the body wants to stay at, and it has these sort of thermostat systems that keep those levels in place. So for example, and we'll look at this blood sugar level example even more in the next chapter, but when you eat food, anything that has carbohydrates, you remember carbohydrates includes the simple sugars and the polymers, the polysaccharides. And the polysaccharides are broken down by hydrolysis in the small intestine. And all of those simple sugars are then dumped into the blood. And that causes the blood sugar, what we call the free blood sugar, to go up. And it's just sugar in your blood. But when that happens, that increase in blood sugar causes your pancreas to secrete an enzyme called, not an enzyme, and a hormone called insulin. It's a protein hormone that's produced by the pancreas, and that goes into the blood. And what insulin doesn't do anything directly to sugar. It just causes your cells to take the sugar in. So the sugar is traveling free in the blood, in the plasma, and then when insulin is released, it triggers the body cells to take the sugar from the blood into the cells. And that causes the free blood sugar levels to drop again, because now the sugar has moved into the cells. It's not in the blood plasma anymore. So blood glucose levels drop. And the glucose that's inside the cells can be connected together to make glycogen for storage, or it can be used for respiration, so glycolysis. So either way, it's inside the cells, so it's not part of the blood glucose anymore. So the blood glucose level goes down. And then that causes the insulin to stop being secreted. And so that's just a feedback loop that just keeps going. Once your blood level, though, when your blood glucose level gets too low, there's actually a second feedback loop, and it has to do with a hormone called glucagon. And when the blood sugar gets too low, your body releases glucagon, and that makes your cells take some of the sugar that they have and release it back into the blood. And that makes the blood sugar go back up. So your body is trying to keep about 100 milligrams per deciliter of sugar. Deciliter meaning the volume of the blood. So 100 is kind of an easy number to remember. That's the normal blood sugar level. Now that varies a little bit whether you've eaten recently or not eaten in a while, but that's a pretty middle of the road number. So when your blood sugar gets way below 100, then that's when the glucagon is going to be released. And interestingly, it's also released from the pancreas. So the pancreas is really important. If you eat a whole bunch after you eat, then the insulin will be released. So this is kind of like your heater and your air conditioner in your house kind of alternatingly keep the house temperature at a set point. In the same way, insulin and glucagon keep your blood sugar at a set point. And your body temperature is regulated in a very similar way, in a negative feedback. If you get too hot, then your body will respond. Sweating, for example, helps to cool the body back down. If your body gets too cold, then you will shiver, you will scrunch up, and your body will get warmer. And so there are many of these systems in the body that work to try to counteract anything that is moving the body away from the set point. There is some positive feedback. Positive feedback can't go on forever, but what positive feedback means is when something starts to happen, it actually causes that to happen even more. So a good example of positive feedback is labor. When a woman goes into labor, her brain releases something called oxytocin. That causes the uterus to contract. It causes the baby's head to push on the cervix. Stretching of the cervix causes the brain to release even more oxytocin, which makes the contractions even stronger, which makes the baby's head push even more, which makes the brain send out more oxytocin. So it just keeps going more and more and more, stronger and stronger and stronger. But positive feedback has to end some point. So delivery of the baby stops the whole system. So positive feedback doesn't just go on and on forever. But during labor, this is a type of positive feedback where the release of the oxytocin ultimately causes more release of oxytocin. Another example of positive feedback in humans is blood clotting. When there's an injury, some of the cells that are at the site of the injury release chemical signals which cause more cells to come, and they release signals, and more cells come and they release signals, and it just explodes in very much an increased kind of exponential way to make the blood clotting happen quickly, but ultimately, eventually it shuts down. So positive feedback is only during a very definable period of time. It's not something that goes on indefinitely.